Welcome to Creative Goo, everybody. I'm Harry, I'm the host, and today it's just me, so if you're expecting a guest, I apologize. The guest I had planned for this week is not feeling well, so we'll just go with Harry and his creative goo-ness. This stream is sponsored by Gooey Cube and the fine folks over there, and this is their Twitch channel, so glad you found us. Happy to have you here. And happy to be talking about all things creative on this creative stream. So let me talk about what we're going to be doing today. I'm going to be talking about digital sculpting, in particular, how you would digital sculpt for miniatures. I've covered a little bit of this before, but I'm going to go into more detail and show off some other stuff. So, hey, Geeky. Hey, everybody. Nice to see you here. As usual, I am monitoring chat, so if you have questions or would like to see something, please do a message in the chat, and I will cover that. So happy to do that. You can find my work on my mini factory. The links here on the screen, and you can find me on Facebook at Harry's 3D Sculpting. And Gooey Cube's available, gooeycube.com. And let's see what else. The Gooey's Den of Enlightenment, Gooey Cube Den of Enlightenment, is the Facebook group for Gooey Cube if you're interested in joining us there. And there's also a Gooey Cube Discord called Gooey Cube. So feel free to check it out. We're a great community, lots of fun people, and lots of creativity. So first I want to talk a little bit about digital sculpting for 3D printing. So digital sculpting is definitely an industry that covers lots of ground. So obviously people know about it for video games and movies. With 3D printing, it's become very much part of other businesses, including miniatures, but also costuming, props, and just-in-time manufacturing, as well as prototyping. So there's lots of different uses for digital sculpting and digital modeling. And the purpose that you're doing really does matter. And so I know some people that use it for designing industrial pipe layout and in 3D sculpting. And there's another person who works with etymologists, and he draws bugs, and they're completely biologically accurate. And he works with them to make sure they can do representations of those bugs so they can zoom in and stuff. And so from the microscopic photos, he creates digital sculpts. So again, digital sculpting can be used in multiple industries by multiple types of business. And I sculpt for 3D printing. So while I'm familiar with all those other things, I make choices when I'm sculpting to optimize for miniatures. And let's see if I can show you guys some examples. So where did it go? Let me go to screen share here. That's actually a digital sculpt, not very good for 3D printing, and I can explain if people want to know, but that just popped up in my screensaver. So let me move this here. And this character, for those of you that have seen it before, I sculpted as a ornament for people's Christmas trees and things like that. And then I printed it and painted it for my friends and family. So I do this every year. Some people are lucky enough to get one. I can't paint thousands of miniatures or even hundreds of miniatures. So if you want it, this is an STL file available on my mini factory. But this is just a photo, or a render, I should say, of the miniature. And you can see there's a lot of things that are unique here. So like her hands, the garland kind of goes around it. The garland's really thick. It's actually not particularly realistic because I needed to be able to print and hang from a tree. And then I had to embed this ring, and I kind of made it along the lines of her hat. But this was really important so that it printed in a solid way. Let's see. Yep. Let me go back. And this is how she printed out. So she stands, so you can put her on your desk, or you can hang it as an ornament. And you can see why I needed it to be thick and I needed it to be sturdy, because this is going to be on someone's Christmas tree. It could fall off, it will likely break, but at least you could glue it back together. But it is a very sturdy little piece, and the choices that you make matter here. And so very delicate or very thin parts are not going to work very well if your purpose is for this to be an ornament to hang on a tree. And then if I go to here, this is the fully painted version. The other thing I did, and the reason she's so shiny, is I actually did a gloss varnish so that the paint won't chip or crack. It has a very thick coat of varnish on it to protect it. So those are the things you would do for this purpose. Now, gaming miniatures, there's a different purpose, because you can tell how stylized she is. She has a very big head, not very realistic proportions. All those things go into the decisions when you're modeling, right? So this is just an illustration of one of the models that I did. Another thing you have to pay attention to when you're sculpting in digital modeling is contrast, or how much it's going to show. So if I move, oops, let me grab it and find the render version of this guy. This will work. So this is a character I sculpted, and he's NPC, or actually a pre-gen character for GUI Cube. He is a special ancestry from there, where he's kind of somewhat of an undead or a living dead character. So his face is very, very skull-like, and you can see that detail here in the model. And looks really great in this render. And you can see there's other details. There's buckles along his vest area. Hey, scary guy. There's buckles on his vest. And then there's these designs I put on his sleeves. There's all kinds of detail here in this miniature. And on screen, it looks fantastic, right? Well, if I look at how it printed, you can see that some of the details are there. I can see that he has these pouches. I can see the buckles on his legs. They showed up. But some of the detail, like on his arm, you can barely see the design I did on his arm. The other thing you can see is that depending on your printer settings, part of his rifle handle is broken. Now, it still looks good, and I still painted it, but if it was you're printing it at home, it's just something you have to be careful of. The other thing you'll notice, you can't tell because the resin had some residue on it, but the details of his face are really hard to see here. And that's one of the things you have to worry about. Is the detail going to show up when you print it? Here's another print of that same miniature, and you can see it better. So it didn't end up with that residue. So I printed it a second time, and you can see his face a little stronger. So if we look at it painted, this is one of the ones I printed, and you painted it, and you still can't see like the teeth in his face because there wasn't enough contrast, sculpted detail contrast, not color contrast. Color contrast I'll talk more about when we talk about painting. And remember, everybody, if you have any questions, feel free to post them in the chat and I can answer them, or if you have comments or would like me to show something else. So here's that other print that was a little cleaner, and you can see zoomed in that the teeth actually show. But remember too, this guy is I can't really zoom further away, but this guy is an inch tall. So on the table, you're not going to see the teeth anyway. But people like to pick up miniatures and look at them up close, and so some of those details are going to matter. And I was able to paint, if I zoom in again, I was able to paint those designs that he has on his leather coat, and they show up and they read pretty good on the screen as well as on the tabletop. So I'm happy with it. There's some things I would do differently if I was going to do it again, but that illustrates when you're going to print something, the choices you need to make. Another example I have before we get into ZBrush and I start playing in Putty is this character. Well, let me move it so you can see it. I think I actually have wrong direction. Yeah, so here it's in green, but here is the um, digital render, right? Pretending to be green stuff. And you can see she has a lot of details. She's got these tassels coming off of her shawl. She's got a lot of hair. And her bow has some details. And you can't tell because I can't rotate this. This is just a fixed static render, but that she's got a knife in her hand. So it's really cool. Well, she's a halfling. Well, how big do you print this? Right? So that it reads as a halfling, but it's also a fun miniature to paint. And so this is the same miniature in two sizes. One is like true scale halfling. That's the one on the right. And then on the left, we've got a bigger version. She still reads as a halfling when you look at her next to another miniature, but she's bigger. So I could put more detail into her face when I was painting it. You can see some of the there's little ornaments that are woven into her hair, those kinds of things, and you can really get all the tassels. Now, I have a good printer, so you still get the tassels at the smaller scale, but you don't quite get all of the ornaments in her hair. They blend into her hair a bit, and some of the other details blend in because it's just almost an order of magnitude smaller. Now you like again, if you look at it up close, you can see the details, but only with a good paint job. Or if you just do a wash, the details will pop. And so to show you, I think it's this direction. No, there we go. This is my stock human character I purchased from a manufacturer whose name I don't remember off the top of my head, but he's human scale. So the little one is truly a halfling, the one on the far right. And the one in the middle, she's almost as tall as he is, but you can still read it as a halfling on the table, and you feel like you're playing with a small character, not as chunky as a dwarf. A lot of times, though, you will see miniatures where the scale's not true scale. The rule of cool matters. Also, is it paintable? All those things. Like oftentimes, dwarf miniatures are as tall as a human. They're just big and stocky, and that's what makes them look like a dwarf, not because they're the right size. I have a 8K printer that I print now. I have lots of printers, but the ones I printed these two on is an 8K Saturn II, so it can print. I think I currently print at 0.03 or 0.3 resolution, so it's pretty small. The printer can do a little bit smaller, but then it's more finicky. So Scary asked whether what print resolution I can print at. So it's very good. Now I get similar details even with a lower resolution printer. I have a 2K printer, and I get pretty close. And so I think that these advancements in technology have been great to make the details crisper, but you still can print a really nice job on an older printer at 2K or 4K. So I know 12K is available now. I'm not sure that you and I can tell the difference on those prints, as well as, and the major advancements now are about speed and usability of the printer. So great question. Okay, I think I have a couple of other things to show. Yeah, so first I've been talking about this miniature. It's not a miniature, it's big, but I've been talking about this miniature for a couple of sessions now. I basically sculpted a brontosaurus. It's the biggest miniature that I've personally created and printed. And so this is what it looks like as a render in the software. And then let's see if I can find a print of this miniature here to show you. Nope, wrong direction. So here's the printed version of the brontosaurus. So there's a dwarf miniature and a Tyrannosaurus Rex to show you the scale of this miniature. So again, very, very big. Now I had to print in multiple parts so you can see, if I zoom in, that there are places that I had to glue it together and then with epoxy putty filled in the gaps and then kind of sculpted in with the actual tool some of the details so that it would read, and so you wouldn't see the seam line, that straight seam line. And so it printed out really nice. I'm going to do another episode on what do you do with the print failure, because this actually had a problem and I fixed it. So I saved the miniature, because that's a lot of resin to feel like you've ruined and throw it away. And so I was able to paint this guy. So let me bring this up. And this is the Brontosaurus fully painted with my same human miniature for scale. So he's a big guy. But he printed up. He was a lot of fun to paint. The skin texture came out really, really nice, and I had a lot of fun. Oh, that's the wrong. And here's from the side again with the human for scale. He comes up to about the equivalent of the knees of this guy. You could print this guy bigger. This is actually based on the scale that I found online. Next to a human. How big? Now there's lots of different large dinosaurs, the four-legged dinosaurs. When I was growing up, they were almost all called Brontosaurus. There's other kinds now. I'm not a dinosaur expert, but this is the one I had a lot of fun making. So he's not biologically accurate for a Brontosaurus or one of those others, but he's close using the rule of cool. I had a lot of fun making this guy. So I think I have, some other angles so you can see the detail on this guy. So again, when you're sculpting for the purpose of printing. And so there's things that you do, and there's things that like this skin texture looks really, really great printed as a miniature. If this was on screen, on a movie like Jurassic Park, that texture would not look realistic at all. So, but it looks great, in miniature form. So those are things that you have to think about when you're doing digital sculpting and want to 3D print it. Let's see if I have any more pictures. Oh yeah, this is another illustration of a recent job I did. And so this is a skull bone thief creature. And you can see that I printed it with an integrated base. And so you can see that there's parts that stick out, and then there's parts that are molded kind of into the base. And that's because, and you can see from the front that, some of this is freestanding and other parts are molded in. I think I have one where you look at it from the top. So here's a better example. So this centipede-like creature kind of crawls over itself and then stands up. And there's lots of legs and lots of pieces. Well, there I printed one without the base, and it worked, but it's not really usable as a miniature. I pretty much had to manually build the base to do the same thing that I did here with the mold. So this molded base is how this miniature is available for anybody that wants to print it. But here it is for scale, so it's pretty big, but still, here it is with the legs, and you can see there's lots of little legs. They were breaking off. Let me zoom in a bit. These little legs were breaking off. The connection between two parts of the creature would snap, so you'd have this section, this segment of the body that was no longer attached, and a lot of problems that if you got this for me, you wouldn't be happy with me because there were so many problems with this print. Now I could redesign the miniatures so that those legs are connected together, merged together, things like that. And that's some of the things that I'll show you guys here in ZBrush. But it's really important to understand, the impact of printing on your models. And so here's the guy. Like I said, I ended up making a base that gave me the same benefits of that integrated base, so that those legs don't break off anymore as you play with it on the table. And then here's what it looks like painted with the integrated base. So it still turned out really good. There's still, bones and things I put in the base that you can highlight and bring out. And you can see that this creature kind of crawls over itself to attack. So it worked really, really well as a model. And so I'm happy with the integrated base and how it turned out. So this is the Bone Thief I've recently done. But again, if this was going to be in a movie, it wouldn't work. But on the tabletop, it looks really, really good. And the photos kind of show that. So I'm getting better at photography, so hopefully you guys can see what I'm talking about in these pictures. Okay. If I go to ZBrush, you can see that this is that model I was talking about, where you have the details all across this model. And there's lots of cool stuff here. Like here's the rifle handle, and here's the detail on his sleeve, and they look really good. And then the details on his rifle, there's a lot going on there. And I had just so much fun. The challenge, though, is in his face. Let's zoom in and then come down. Whoops. I'm not used to manipulating ZBrush with a microphone in my face. There we go. So you can see those teeth look really good here in the sculpt. The challenge, however, is, he's only an inch tall, so his head's going to be like a 1/7 or 1/8 of an inch. And that means the teeth are, I'll go to switch to millimeters, so it's easier. It's like 1 millimeter or 2 millimeters to, up and down, and side to side, it's maybe 3 or 4 millimeters. So that's not a lot of space to showcase something. And so what I would have to do if I wanted the teeth to be more prominent is actually, make that mouth bigger, something like that. And now that's going to have a much better chance of showing up. The other thing I can potentially do is inflate the teeth. Let me not inflate with such a big brush size. So I can inflate each tooth, right? And so that there's more, I was talking about that contrast, right? So the digital contrast, so there's distance between these things, and maybe I could, make sure the top and bottom teeth has more to show, right? And so you can see here, that's going to likely print out more prominently at an inch tall, right? So that's going to be really important. So it's those kind of things. You can even see now on the screen that shows up pretty well. Even this small, I can see the teeth, right? So that's still bigger than he's going to print, right? That's probably, this is how big he's going to print. And so at the table, if you're looking at it across the table, you might now see a white line where his teeth are. And then if you pick it up and look at it, you're really going to see those teeth, right? The other thing you want to think about is what's going to be the use of the miniature. If it's somebody's character, or if it's a general and you're playing a war game, you want as much detail as possible because it's your general or it's your character. If it's one of 50 goblins, it's less important to have those details. And so you have to decide as a sculptor, what are you going to focus on? Now, most of us now sculpt all that detail regardless of the miniature and its use, and let the painter decide. But you do want to think about it. And then in this case of this guy, because he's a miniature, he's going to be on a base. I went ahead with this cloak like this, but it's an artistic choice, but it's also going to matter for when you're printing it and also when you're gaming with it. Will this barrel of this rifle stand up to casual gameplay? Chances are it's going to break off. If you're at a table with adults and everybody's careful, it could last a lifetime. But if with young people or rambunctious players, that stock, that rifle barrel is likely to break off. The same problem with staves and spears and things like that. If it looks cool for it to be heading out on its own at that angle, but it could break off. And so a lot of the older miniatures, as much was attached to the body as possible, because 3D printing can print this and it'll look good, like I showed you in the photographs. You can have so much more fun. I mean, there's actually even a hole in the barrel. So if you paint a little black in there, it looks like a barrel of a gun. And the same with this cloak. It's not super thick, but that will matter at the game table. And And so sometimes you can make it too fragile and it's going to be a problem. Again, knowing the purpose of your sculpt informs your decision. So a real cloak is going to be in on this image have almost no thickness. I mean, cloth has very little thickness, but I'm printing it on a printer, so it has to be a physical distance so that it prints successfully, and it needs to be thick enough that it would survive gameplay, or even if you're putting it on the on a tabletop, potentially even to survive the painting process. And so you have to think about that when you're doing it. So I've got some miniatures with lots of capes and cloaks and flowing, and because of printer resolution, you can do it. And I'm lucky enough that if it breaks, I can just print another one and paint it. And I love painting, so it's not really a problem for me. If you're buying it from someone else, you know, you want to make sure that that miniature is as sturdy as you can make it. I avoid multi-part because it just makes the printing more complicated. But there are, let me see if I can show you guys a multi-part miniature and some of the challenges you may have working with a multi-part miniature. Let's see. No, that's not where I want to go. Nope. Let me find it here. Let's see if this should work. But that's just Mr. Goo. Doesn't have the hats. Yeah, that works. So I sculpted Alphinius Goo quite a while ago, a couple of years ago. He's still relevant today, so don't worry about it. And so his body and his staff are one part, right? And you can see his cloak is relatively thin too, but because it mostly rests on the base and the bottom of the staff will be glued to the base as well, it stays pretty sturdy. The biggest challenge is going to be his fingers. As you can see, his fingers are spread. And so you have to be careful how you print it, but it prints really neat when you do. But he's got all these hats. Well, the first challenge I found was some of the hats need to fit basically like he's bald, like a skull cap. And so if you've sculpted hair, this is not digital hair that moves. This is physically sculpted. Like if I just go to his head, I've digitally sculpted this hair. Well, when I put a cap on it, that doesn't work. Like if I grab, yeah, this one works. Hide this one. So that doesn't work. You can see he's got this skull cap, but some of his hair sticks out. And so I had to have two heads. So if you print this out, there's the head with the hair, and then there's a head without hair. So you can see that the skull cap can fit on his head. There, you know, I could have made 8 heads, each with a hat on it. What I did was I sculpted 8 hats that you'd then glue on the head. I think if I was going to redo this model, I would have the head be with a hat. And so it's going to be easier to print and have fewer problems than just printing each, you know, head separately from the body. So you can see there's this body without a head, and then there's the head that you can glue and it fits right there on the body. And then there's this head that's bald, right? The other thing you can see, I guess it doesn't show on this one, but you have to know which hat goes with which head. And so I printed a bunch of hats, or I sculpted a bunch of hats, and each one, goes with a different, head. You could glue these hats onto anything. You would just have to either sand down the head, the hair flip or whatever. He's got this scrunchy hat. This is my favorite, his bonnet with the flowers. Um, there's the skull cap. I did a cube, of gooey cube that you can glue to his head, and then this, kind of beanie, winter hat, like a pirate hat, a scarf thing, and then there's this hat. I think, yeah, it has a jewel on it. Let's see if I can. Yeah, you can see it now. There's this turban type thing with a jewel on it. So all different parts. And then the pipe is also separate, so you can have it with the pipe or without the pipe. The pipe's probably the hardest thing to print all by itself. I made a sprue to print it. And so these are things, I'm not much of an engineer, so I sculpted it, and it took a lot of time to make the sprue that had the heads on it and the pipe on it, a sprue that had hats on it, and they print okay. It did work. Ultimately, a lot of trial and error. But now you know why I don't like multi-part miniatures, because you have to engineer it. Now, the software that's available today makes it easier to cut the model and to make sure that both pieces print and everything. I did this before those features were available, but even when you can cut the model, when they demo the product, it shows how cool and how easy it is to make multi-part. In reality, it's still hard, because you're talking about translating these digital pixels into a physical product. So those are some things that you have to keep in mind depending on what you're modeling. And this is also an illustration of other things you have to worry about. So he's got this cloak. Well, if the cloak is flowing and blowing in the wind and pulls away from his back, and now it's extra fragile because the only point it's touching anything is at his neck, and that's going to be a challenge when you're printing it, but also on the table. So oftentimes what I do is most of the cloak or cape will be flush with the human body and only flare out at the bottom. And it's an artistic choice, but it also has a practical value because that makes it less fragile on the tabletop. And also, if I was going to do the pulling away from the body, I might make the cloak thicker and then maybe have his arm back so there's another touch point. So it's not just purely freestanding. And I know all of you have seen miniatures where there's these dynamic poses and things, and the more dynamic is the more engineering you have to do. Like I said, for this staff, I mean, he could have been holding it over his head, makes the miniature more fragile. So good stuff there. Oh, actually, I'm going to leave. Let me get his head back so that he doesn't look like he's a disembodied dude. That looks pretty good. But some other things I sculpted that, to illustrate this point of purpose is the details and the accessories you put on a miniature. So in Zayate, all the gods, of course, have symbols to represent them. So either somebody who's a follower or a devout person might have those symbols on their person, either as a medallion or it's part of their shield or armor. So this one is I think he's the god of righteous battle, and he has 2 crossed swords, right? Well, if I made this symbol with 2 regular crossed swords, that's going to be really fragile in the middle if it's the thickness of a sword. So what I did was I mirrored it on the other side and connected it in the middle. So you can see there's actual physical geometry inside this medallion. So no matter where I put it, it's going to hold together. It's not going to break. It'll print successfully, those kinds of things. And these choices are really important. Well, I also have these very detailed blades on this thing. It looks great on the screen, but if I add it to, our Alphinius character, where did he go? Can't find it now. There it is. Let's make it a little bigger. Move it up, turn it around. Oh, I think I added it to the wrong one. He doesn't have a head. But you can see I have all this detail on it, but if I make it a medallion on his neck, I'll even make it thicker, put it on there. So now he's got his holy symbol on. Well, again, he's going to be about that big, maybe a little bigger. I'll make him a little bigger. So can you see the cross swords? Can you see the detail on the hilt of those swords? You know, there's that monster face, there's the yin yang symbol. Maybe, maybe not. And so where you decide to put your detail, you need to understand how it's going to print, how it's going to read. Now, if I, look at it really close, I'll see two cross swords for sure. I know my printer, I know, but will I realize how detailed and intricate those sword hilts are? Probably not, right? And so then another one I did was this thing. So this is the symbol of the god of chaos in the world of Zayate. Once again, a really cool symbol. I got it so you can, have it, be on either side. Well, again, if I add it to the same character, okay, let's make it a little bigger. And let's say it's hanging from his wrist. Okay, well, turn it so that it's hanging there. Like it's a charm bracelet or something. Well, again, it looks really cool on the computer. That looks really neat. I can make a bracelet out of it and do something really cool there. Well, the problem is it'll probably even print, but it's going to snap off. I mean, there's just no way that's going to survive. And so you have to know that when you're making models. So let's put it on his chest. The nice thing about Zayate is everybody is followers of multiple deities, right? So let's put it on his chest as another symbol. And I did something similar with another character, and you could hardly tell that he had multiple symbols on his chest because they are so small. And there's nothing wrong with that, but how much effort are you going to put into sculpting those pieces if it's not going to show? So again, let's take them back to actual size. And can you tell he's got something on his chest? Yes. Can you see the detail? Kinda. And so that one's not too bad. Like that has a lot of digital contrast or physical contrast versus color contrast. And so that's probably going to read like if I had the background a dark color and then made that gold or silver, you'd see it, right? So again, you really want to understand how it's going to look at, actual size. So that looks pretty good. I'm okay with that. Well, this symbol, that's going to be a lot easier to deal with, right? Because it's a disc and you have the sun rays and everything molded into it. Now, again, you could have done the rays, but if they were separate from that disc, they'd never survive the printing process or, on the tabletop. But you've got them kind of molded in, so it's still going to read from multiple angles. That thing could be used a lot. You could put it on a shield, you could put it on a chest plate, put it on a backpack. I mean, lots of things you could do that. Might even be able to make it a charm on that wrist if you had it at an angle that gave it more support. So this one is a lot easier to deal with. This is the God Radion, so definitely a good one. Similar, this one here is gonna be able to be put anywhere. But if it'll read, you're probably going to get a nice little gear effect. But the candle itself, you probably wouldn't recognize as a candle unless you got it really close to your face or you knew what you were looking at. And like I said, I made all these because, I'm having some fun with these symbols. It gave me a break from sculpting characters. But, and I'll put them on characters I sculpt for the world of Zayate to tie them to the world. But where you put them and how big you make them is going to tell whether or not they read. Again, you put this on a shield, everybody's going to know that that's a candle in a gear kind of thing. Then there's this one, which is a compass. You can tell it's a compass because I have the cardinal letters on there, north, south, east, and west. Let me zoom in so you can maybe see it, turn the angle so you get some visual contrast. So it works pretty well, but again, those letters are going to virtually disappear if it's just a medallion on his chest. And so the other cues are going to be there. So I had fun making it, but it's not going to have a universal use on miniatures. And then this is another one that looks really good. This one's only one-sided because it was not going to be printable with two sides. There was some technical issues with how I built it. And so I just made it one-sided, which will work in most cases. But again, this filigree look and everything will get lost depending on how small you make the object. If it really is the size of a charm on somebody's bracelet, there's no way. It'll just look like a little, might as well just put a sphere on the miniature so you get this little dots of silver that you paint. But if this is the chest plate, or if it's on a shield, or maybe back of a cloak, that's really going to show up and it would paint up really nice. The other thing you can do with digital that you can't do with other mediums is, this has a lot of 3D to it, right? Well, because of the way this medium works, I can actually reduce that thickness. Well, if I look at it head on, I still get the details. I can still see the filigree and the lines inside the filigree. I can still see that there's flames there. And so I take advantage of this a lot. So I sculpt something like I had a bear head. Well, I was able to flatten that bear head and put it on somebody's bracer. And you could paint it and still see that there was a bear embossed on his bracer. So there's some advantages to making these objects because you can adjust them to the purpose. Like flattening it out like this and then wrapping it onto a cloak, even with the wrinkles in the cloak, that would be really cool looking. And so really, really neat stuff. Again, if anybody has any questions, please feel free to pop them in chat, or if you want to see something in particular. I'm just going through kind of the theory of sculpting for miniatures and the things you need to think about when you're doing that. Here, this is something that everybody that's worked with miniatures already knows. Although I've seen some 3D prints that do it, it's really hard to put a string on a bow. Now with the older metal miniatures, I mean, you could add a string with wire later, but it could never be cast with a bowstring. Now plastic models could potentially be, but they're likely going to be break. Well, the same challenge here with a miniature. Most of us just make a bow and you imagine there's a bowstring, or some modelers will take very, very fine gauge wire and put the bowstring on a bow. So please ignore the fact that she's carrying a bow that she couldn't actually use. One of the things to mention, I didn't have pictures of the back of this miniature in the 2 scales. One of the things that got lost was the details on her quivers, right? So the star symbol and the rivets on her thing, at that smaller scale, they hardly showed up at all. Part of it too was how I had to orient the model to print. So there were supports that were there, and to get rid of the supports, it messed with the detail as well at that small of a resolution, because you don't want supports on her face or on details that matter. So the supports mostly were on her back, and I had to make sure that her blade printed successfully as well. So there was some careful things I did. The other thing you don't see when it's printed that I sculpted in was the texture on her leggings, right? So she's got this leather texture going on. Well, that didn't show up in the smaller print at all, and only barely showed in the next higher print. So a lot of cloth textures and things that you might do are just not going to show up when you print. And so do you put effort into making those textures? And the answer is maybe, right? So wrinkles you definitely want to show, because it makes it look very real to see the fabric pulling in the correct way. I'm not great at it, but I certainly add wrinkles where necessary. You can see there's a little bit of wrinkles in the middle of her tunic there, and then of course he's got the flowing cape, with some wrinkles in it. So some models I do more than in others, but the really best sculptors show that. So that texture will show and it'll really make a difference. But to put like the weave of the fabric itself, like a denim weave or something, it's just not going to show. So you have to get the texture another way. Or you could exaggerate it. You could like do burlap and make it really big, and it'll be a really fun texture for your painter, the person who's painting the miniature, but it won't be realistic because no weave is that thick for somebody that's going to wear it, right? And so there's a lot of choices that you make so that it reads on the screen. And that leads me to the final topic I want to talk about, which is what's going to read in a miniature versus what's realistic. I talked about already that this really thick cloak is actually not that thick when you print it and could be fragile, but it's way thicker than the actual cloak would be. So if I was sculpting for a TV or a game or something like that, that cloak would be very, very, very thin. But it's not going to work when you print it. And so you have to make some sacrifices. The other thing that happens is if I have layered clothing, I think Siobhan actually shows the layered clothing better. So she's got leggings, then she's got this tunic, and the tunic goes over and there's buttons. Then there's this strap from her quiver. Then she's got this shawl and there's a collar. Well, there's no way any of those things are that thick. And so she actually bulks up if you make all of those things as thick as they need to be to read. Well, so what you end up having to do, let me show you it. Let me close in and show you what I mean. Whoa. Sorry about that effect, right? So her shawl has thickness, you can see along here, but I push it in right over her bodice area, right? So that it doesn't keep bulking up. So it looks like she's got this huge thing in her chest, right? And the same thing with, I want just enough thickness to show that her tunic folds over and then gets buttoned. And there's actually, stitching, I've got in here that shows up okay, and then the buttons. But what I didn't show is the creasing that happens when you button clothes, that the fabric pulls. And so there's more I could have done, but would it read? And would it be critical to the success? The other thing is the shawl is wool. It's like a woven material. Well, that's not going to print very well. And so her tassels, same thing. Do you do frayed wool yarn for her tassels? No, I just made tubes. And then I did a sphere. But on the print, that turned out actually to look really, really good. If you remember the print, I can actually maybe find it again real quick. So as a miniature, that reads really well. You can see that there's that little sphere that I had put, looks like a knot, and then you can see the tassels hanging off of it, and the tassels hang pretty well, right? And then you can see the buttons on her tunic, and they look okay, but you don't see any of the stitching, right? You just don't see it. There's a little bit of stitching showing. Let's see if I can zoom in some more. Right here on her wrist, the stitching shows up a little bit. So that's definitely, a nice touch that you can see some of the wrinkles, right? And so you're not going to, your human eye is not going to be able to zoom in this close, actually, but it does look pretty good in a photograph. So again, knowing the final result, and then in her hair, I've got these jewel, these tubes, that are like supposed to be at the end of her braids, to tie off her braids, these metal things, and they printed out really well too. And but the smaller one, you could hardly see them. The difference between the hair and those little jewels was not strong enough. And the knot that I did for her shawl, the contrast just didn't work well enough. So you can see, you print it, you can tell it was a shawl, but you wouldn't really know unless it's a really good painter that put some lines into it that it was knotted like that. The other thing that I do is I'll do eyebrows. Most of the time they're not going to be on the print, but it helps me when I'm sculpting to have the eyebrows there. Sometimes I'll also have an eye with the actual iris and everything on the sculpt, but it doesn't. It's so small, it has no impact on the printout, and so it's just deciding, what you want to do to make this sculpt work. So there's choices that you make, and like her bow, is short bow actually works pretty well. A long bow usually ends up to being way thicker than you want it to be. The other thing you have to be careful of is the blade. I mean, she couldn't use this blade in combat. There's no way. There's no edge. It's not sharp at all, right? There's a little bit of a point there because I can print that successfully. You can see there's a point, right? So she's got a point on her blade, but there's no edge. Well, that's because if I print an edge and it's a thin like a blade, it's just going to snap off. In fact, I've done that. I have models where I really like the look of the thin blade and it printed okay, but as soon as it ended up gaming on the table, it snapped off. It's just the way the world is, right? And so I've used wire and other things to replace it. But when you're printing, and in the old days, like Games Workshop miniatures, their hands were huge, the blades were huge because they sell that product to effectively to children. 10 to 12 years old is the first target. And so they made things very big, and that's why the scale is a little unusual and things like that. And now companies have gone back to true scale. I actually don't enjoy true scale. The WizKids miniatures are true scale, and for me, at my age and my painting skill, they're too small. The face, even of a human, I can hardly get any detail in there, even with my magnifying glasses. I can hardly get any detail to paint the face. It's just so small. And the gnomes, they're like 10 millimeters tall, maybe 12. And what kind of detail can I do, even with an enlarged head? And so you really so I print my miniatures a little oversized. I'm in the 32 millimeter heroic, it's called, which is really these days almost 38 to 40 millimeters. If she has big hair like this, like if she was human in proportion with that big hair, she'd actually be 40 millimeters printed. That's how tall she'd be. And like Zakramar, he's got this hat with a feather, so he's really tall. In fact, let me see if I can tell you exactly how tall he prints. Yeah, he prints with the feather. He's 48 he's almost 50 millimeters tall. He's really tall, but it's because of the feathers and stuff makes him really tall. If I just, let me go ahead and update this. And if I just measure him to his eyes, he's 40 millimeters. So he's still even tall. And I wanted him to be tall. He's supposed to be a tall character. He towers over others. So he, again, next to that human miniature I showed you guys earlier, he'd be a little taller. But if you make him smaller, then again, his face just melts away. And so those are things, every miniature you want to be thinking about that when you're sculpting. And so the other thing you can see that you very rarely find when you're printing that you'd even notice, he's not just wearing gloves. The gloves are fingerless. Well, unless you knew that going in, you'd probably just paint them as gloves, which is okay. But if you knew, then you could paint his fingers, that pale, death color, and then give him brown gloves, and that'd look really cool. I think I painted them as gloves, honestly. And so, because it doesn't read, you can't tell they're fingerless gloves even when I pull away to the size of the screen, you can hardly tell that those are fingerless gloves, right? So how would you make sure that you could tell? There's not a lot of ways to do that. I could make the gloves thicker, and so there'd be more resolution around that, and that might work. But then would it look goofy to have these really thick gloves and then his fingertips sticking out? And that's the challenge. And so I see really, really fancy miniatures today because of the resolution of printers. But can everybody paint to the level of contrast to showcase that detail? And I can sorta, and so, but if somebody's new and just starting out to try and capture all that detail, just don't know. And so, I have a high level of detail in my miniatures, but I'm trying to strike a balance. And having stuff like this cloak that you could do anything with, having a surface to paint on can be a lot of fun for a painter, where if you've had all the details in it, then all you're doing is putting color on a miniature. And are you really showcasing your talent? That is another advantage of the Games Workshop miniatures is there's a lot of surface, like Space Marines, for example. You can do a lot of designs or weathering, all kinds of different things because the models are, they're not simple, but they're straightforward. There's a lot of surface area. And they could have sculpted that stuff on there. But then what do I do as a painter to showcase my talent or my skill? So just lots of things to think about. If you're digital sculpting and you have a purpose like 3D printing and putting these miniatures on the tabletop, you really need to understand the final result. And one of the advantages I have is I sculpted. Well, I've been painting miniatures for an incredibly long time, but I've also been sculpting, and I started sculpting with physical material, epoxy putty, and that drove a lot of understanding of what you can do at an inch tall, and that's and I love the digital sculpting. I can do so much more than I could with the physical medium. I reached a plateau that I could never get past, and with digital sculpting, I've been able to just continually improve my skills beyond that plateau. I'm so far beyond what I could do with my little tools that I had made. But I'll talk about physical sculpting in another future episode. And speaking of future episodes, we're approaching the end of the day. So any questions from anybody? Any, topics you'd like to see covered in future episodes? Love to get your feedback either here in Twitch or on Facebook or, any other way you know how to get a hold of me. I'd love to add content that you guys are interested in. I will have more guests. I'm rescheduling for December, having to shuffle things around because we missed a guest this week. But more guests coming, more topics to cover, and would love to have you join us. Again, any questions? Well, with that, I want to wish you all a great day. Hope you have a wonderful weekend ahead, and I will see you next week right here on Creative Goo.